Welcome everyone to DRJ's webinar series. I'm Bob Arnold, President here at Disaster Recovery Journal. We thank you for your attendance today and hope you gather some great information from today's webinar. Everyone's phone has been muted and we ask you to utilize the question panel you'll find on the right-hand side of your screen. Our speaker today will attempt to answer as many of these as possible at the end of the webinar. Our sponsors today are PhD Virtual, a Unitrends company, who provide leading solutions in backup and disaster recovery orchestration for virtual, physical, and cloud environments, and the Disaster Recovery Preparedness Benchmark, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to increase DR preparedness awareness and improve DR practices by allowing organizations to anonymously benchmark their DR practices with other organizations around the world. Joining us today are Robert Payne, Product Marketing Manager, PhD Virtual and Unitrends, as well as Steve Kahan, Vice President of Marketing at PhD Virtual and Unitrends, and the Chairman of Disaster Recovery Preparedness Benchmark Council. With no further introductions, I'd like to welcome and turn the mic over to Steve.
Hey, thank you very much, Bob, and welcome everybody. I hope everyone's having a great day today. I want to thank you for attending the 2014 State of Disaster Recovery Preparedness webinar. There's a number of people who talk about disaster recovery and disaster recovery preparedness, and they've actually never been through a real disaster and have recovered from that. And before I get started, I want to share with you, because I actually went through a real disaster and we recovered from that. And this was a disaster. It was several years ago. I'd worked for one of the world's largest hosting companies. And for those of you who are not familiar with hosting companies, they are companies that have thousands of servers, and that each server that exists within a data center could have one or hundreds of customers with their businesses on those servers. And so I was on a disaster recovery committee, was not accountable for disaster recovery, but I was one of the folks on that team. Really didn't know my role or responsibility, but was informed I was on that team. And one day, I was over a weekend, it was a beautiful day, and I had a phone call and an email. And one of our data centers actually exploded. Turns out there was a gas leak, and as you can imagine, there was big fire. All the servers within that data center were destroyed, which means that the thousands of customers that had their businesses within their data center were destroyed too. Well, when we had that disaster occurred, we sort of had a plan that people really didn't see. And so we kind of just had to wing it. And by winging it, I was the first one in the office. Got into the office, we literally set up a war room where the management team and I helped us to manage through this particular disaster, of which it truly was. And what was interesting was that we decided to be very transparent about this disaster, right? So we were taking pictures of the site, literally photographs, letting people know and see the extent of the coverage and what we were doing to get people back online and carrying out servers and then bringing in generators and whatnot. As it all turns out, we recovered. We rebuilt the data center. Our reputation actually as a company actually increased, particularly with our customers, because we were so transparent during the course of that disaster. But as you can imagine, that as a hosting company, you have service level agreements to keep people's websites, to keep their businesses up and running, and we paid hundreds of thousands of dollars in missed SLAs. So we recovered, went through that disaster, and at that time I really started to study disaster recovery and participated in a number of communities that are available online, and started talking with other people about best practices and asked folks a number of questions, how they were doing, what best practices were from a DR perspective, particularly as it relates to IT. And what I found was that there really were very few best practices out there, and people were always searching to know what were those best practices? How could they get their hands on them? And so about a year ago, we formed a council. The council is with 451 Group, one of the leading analyst groups, Verizon, University of South Florida, the UK's National Health System, and a company called Kahan Technologies. They're actually located in South Africa. We all banded together and we created the drbenchmark.org site. And so our mission as an organization was to increase DR preparedness. We wanted to help people to improve their DR best practices. And what we did was we launched a survey. And in this survey, it takes about 10 minutes. It's available on drbenchmark.org. What you can do is you can literally benchmark for free your company's disaster recovery preparedness. Now, what's really cool about this report is that you get immediate gratification. So you will immediately get a grade like you're in university from an A through an F in terms of how you're doing. And since we've launched this disaster recovery preparedness benchmark at drbenchmark.org, we've had over 2,000 companies now around the globe take that benchmark. And so over the next period of time, what I'd like to do is to share with you what we've learned. What are some of those practices that we've learned? Secondly, to share with you some of the best practices that companies are actually putting in place. And then third, share with you what you could actually do right now, right after this webinar, to start the process of improving DR preparedness within your organization. And then I guess finally point you to a number of free tools that are available for you to help you to improve. So with that, let me just jump right into start with some of the findings. Now, first, the amazing news that we learned is that there is an enormous shortfall in disaster recovery preparedness. And this is really as it relates to how these now over 2,000 companies rated themselves in terms of the worst outage that they went through or disaster. And when you think about it, it's really putting their businesses at risk. So what we learned was that 3 out of 4 companies are failing, and by failing we mean getting a grade of a D or F. Amazingly, 50% of the companies, more than 50%, actually got a failing grade. So this is sort of just the overall finding that we learned. And now what I'd like to do is to start breaking it down into detail, going into depth so you could sort of see how people are doing and where specifically they were failing. And then, of course, what you could do about it. So in an era from an IT perspective where always available means that you need to have near 100% uptime. The respondents to the DR benchmark were very candid in terms of the consequences of the service interruptions. They were very candid about the interruptions as well as the cost of those interruptions to their companies. So first, let's talk a little bit about the interruptions. More than half of the respondents lost critical applications. And by critical applications, this could be their payroll systems, it could be an e-commerce system, it could be email. They lost critical applications or their entire data center for hours or days. These are respondents telling us what they saw. 35% lost one or more of those critical applications for hours at a time. 20+% lost critical applications over a period of days over the last year. Now, 1 in 4 of these organizations lost most of their data center for hours and days as well. So there were significant interruptions when really what you hear so much about is near 100% uptime. And this is really tough on companies, like I'm sure most of you on this webinar, who rely on IT to conduct business within your organization. So these were some of the interruptions that the respondents talked about. But what about the costs associated with those interruptions? So when you look at a lot of the analyst groups out there, they estimate that the that the cost of essentially losing critical applications is estimated to be at about $5,000 per minute. And the losses that the respondents of the DR benchmark claimed were absolutely substantial. Nearly 20% indicated that they had losses of more than $50,000 to over $5 million. What you could see in the box here is that roughly 4% of those companies lost over $1 million. Now, how many CEOs do you think are actually aware of these losses? Now, if they were, do you think that budget or resources for DR that oftentimes is so hard to get would be as hard for you to get? And these are, again, these are some of the costs that people had indicated that they had saw with respect to those outages. But it's more than just those costs. And by the way, we'll get into in just a little bit later how much people are actually spending on DR as well. So the business disruption that these companies also talked about, they talked about disruption in other ways as well. 1 in 5 organizations said that when they had an extended outage or disaster, they could only partially recover data. Think about that. Whether that's customer information, whether that's a critical email that a CEO needs or someone within your company, they can only, 1 in 5 can only partially recover data. 7% that when they had an extended outage or a service interruption, that they lost data for good, which obviously talks, to the extent of some of the backup practices that they had put in place. 1 in 10 of the companies said that the damage that they had due to the extended outages or disasters actually caused damage to their business reputation. Now, I know that probably none of you on the phone who take disaster recovery very seriously had any of these occur within your company. But again, these are the 2,000 plus that responded and were very candid about the damage that they had. And if you look right in the middle of this particular chart, over 9%, it's not just costs, said that the disruption significantly impacted their company's revenue. And so these are some of the disruptions as it relates to disasters, some of the costs that companies are actually placing to that. But what about what causes these extended outages or disasters in the first place? What do you suppose they might be? Think in your mind's eye. If you were to ask someone in the media, for example, you probably talk about like weather events. It's what we always hear about. We hear about maybe it's an earthquake, maybe it's something like a hurricane, like Hurricane Sandy. But really, when you look at what the respondents talked about in terms of what actually causes those disruptions to the business from a DR perspective, it's really the commonplace things. It's the things that happen every day. Is that technology failures or human error, quite frankly, are the major culprits. When you look at things like a weather event, like a hurricane, that's really, definitely plays a factor, but it is not nearly the main factor. So again, when you look at these disruptions, when you look at the costs associated with that, these are really attributable to commonplace things. Software failures, network failures, people making an honest mistake in terms of human error. These are the things that just kind of happen in the course of business. And so it's really almost not even a matter of if extended outages or disasters will happen given these causes. It's more of that they're going to happen. These are the things that happen. And so so you've got to be planning for these disasters very effectively. And so now let's turn our attention to the planning that companies are actually experiencing. Unfortunately, for the 2,000 plus companies that have now taken the DR benchmark, is that DR planning itself is not really done very well. It's kind of a sore spot. And what you could see here is that roughly 70% of the organizations don't have a fully documented DR plan. Now, from an IT perspective, some of the critical things that go into a fully documented DR plan are identifying, for example, the critical applications, the components that need to recover. Very few organizations have that fully documented. Very few organizations have recovery time objectives or recovery point objectives documented. Recovery time objectives, of course, being the time it takes to recover, or recovery point objectives being the point at which you can actually recover. And these are what play back into SLAs, back to the business. Very important that those are documented. And what's amazing, at least to me, in terms of some of these findings, is that very few companies, if you look at sort of at the bottom here, 27.8, have fully even documented what the failover or failback processes are associated with bringing things back online. So what you could start to see a picture here is that from a DR planning perspective, companies need to be doing a much, much better job. So it's really not surprising then when you sort of look at then DR and you sort of look at what organizations are talking about, is that basically 2/3 of the organization said their DR plans, the test plans really didn't exist, or that their DR plan itself was not very useful in the worst outage or disaster that they had. And so, to me, this was not a finding that we expected to see at all. Particularly, if you think about folks who would actually go to sites, spend 10 minutes or so and benchmark themselves, you would think that their DR plans would be there and they'd be in good shape. Now, what about then those that actually do have DR plans? How are they doing? Why are these DR plans not quite as useful? So when you look at the DR plans in terms of really why they're not useful, particularly from a testing perspective, your DR plan is only as good as the last time that it was successfully tested, the last time that it was actually validated to work. And 1/3 of the organizations basically only exercise or test their DR plan once or twice a year. Right? That's just not enough. Almost 25% never test their DR plans. So even if they had a plan, they're not testing their plans or not testing their plans enough. Now, what's interesting then, as you look at the testing themselves, that the DR test plans, kind of are failing by many, many measures. First of which, I want to congratulate those that actually are doing well from a DR testing perspective. 34% of those companies that have taken the benchmark actually completely passed their DR test. I want to congratulate, if any of you who took this survey are on the webcast today, because congratulations, but you're also part of the minority. The reality is that when people are actually testing their plan, only 24% repeat the test if they don't pass. So think about it for a second. If you didn't pass, only 24% even repeat the test to try to pass once more. But then 12.7%, they wait until the next test period. Well, you could say, gee, is that really all that bad? It is when you consider the fact that when people are testing their plans, they're typically testing them every 6 months or every year. So if you didn't pass the test and you're waiting till next year to go make corrections and then validate whether or not that actually will help you to pass, that just isn't going to get it done. And then finally, only 38% even document the results of their testing. And so most organizations, you would think if they're going to go through the process of actually testing, that they would document their results. Now, when you kind of take a look at it, and to me this was also kind of an interesting finding relative to the testing itself, is that when you kind of look at it, is that really you need to be documenting the results. For those who have actually taken the DR benchmark and they're not documenting their results, 65% of those companies actually come from highly regulated industries. Highly regulated industries that actually, from a compliance perspective, need to be able to produce documentation with respect to their testing. And the reason why they're not doing it is that oftentimes they find this reporting manual, they find it very difficult, and so quite frankly they're just not doing it. And these are areas, when you look at validating your test plan from a DR perspective, these are areas and documenting it that could be automated. And many organizations are not taking advantage of the automation that exists out there that are available to them. So when you look at sort of the state that a lot of the organizations struggle with the reporting, they struggle with the testing, why is that? What is it that our respondents actually saw? Well, one of the critical items that the respondents talked about was that 21% felt that they didn't have the skill sets to perform the test. 36% said they just simply don't have the time to test. 18% said it's just too expensive, because the majority said that each test costs between $5,000 and $50,000 based upon the size of their organization. And so these are part of the reasons why the results that we've seen on the previous slides actually are the case. Now, one thing I did want to make sure that I mention is that a lot of this, this testing process could be automated. A lot of the documentation process could be automated. There's a couple of really good tools out there for you to do that. One is made by VMware. It's called SRM. It's a really good tool. It can help you to do that. Another one is by PhD called Reliable DR. It's a really good tool. It could help you to do that as well. Either way, you can't go wrong, but both tools can help you to test. In the case of Reliable DR, it's a little easier and a lot less expensive. Now, when you look at then, what about funding? What about resources? Let's talk about that for just a moment. 2/3 of the organizations that took the DR benchmark said DR is underfunded. And so amazingly, roughly almost 25% said that they have no funding for DR. Now, I'm sure that's not the case for any of you. Hope that's not the case for any of you. But almost 25% of the 2,000 said they have no funding. The rest said, hey, we're underfunded. Which sort of begs the question, which we asked, is, well, what is the right funding? What ought you be spending? And so what we found was that organizations, if you kind of look, this sort of slide breaks it down, of the percent of IT budget that's actually going to DR-related things. So let me just kind of, mention this here. It seems like roughly between 2 and 7% of the total IT budget seems to be that sweet spot in terms of range that is going to DR or DR-related items. I mean, backup is in there, consultants, typically is in there, but that typically is the range of sweet spot that companies are spending in terms of DR as it relates to the percent of their overall IT budget. So far, over the last 24 minutes or so, we've covered why 2 out of 3 companies are failing. We were surprised about these results. I'm sure, maybe these results are surprising to you, but they are the facts. And so, but what about those companies that are doing better, right? There are companies that are doing better, and there are reasons why they're doing better. So let's turn our attention here for a moment to some of the best practices. and really, talk a little bit about what are better prepared organizations doing vis-a-vis those who are kind of failing, and you saw a lot of the reasons why. So what we could sum it up in here, and there's lots of details here, but you can really sum it up into 4 primary areas. First, they are fully documenting their DR plan. Now, shocking, right? I'm sure a lot of you are saying, well, gee, that makes sense. But as you see, most organizations don't have a fully documented DR plan. But it's not just the documentation of the DR plan. Going back to the example of the story I told you when I was involved in DR, I had no idea what my role was. I worked in another function, but I had no idea actually what my role and responsibility was. I knew that I was a part of the DR team, but I was never really trained on what my responsibilities were, what was expected of me, who else was on that DR team, and sort of what were the handoffs between the rest of the people that were sort of on that core team should an extended outage or a disaster occur. So it's not just the documentation of the DR plan, it's really the involvement and training of the core team throughout your organizations so that people understand what's expected of them in their role so they can help you to recover in the event of a disaster. The second best practice is they have specific goals for recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives, and those goals are literally tied to each critical application at a minimum within their organization. In some cases, it's tied to their business services and so on. And so they literally have metrics, typically in the forms of SLAs back to the business, for at least their critical applications. And they have the ability to sort of judge and measure whether or not they'll actually be able to recover to those SLAs. And of course, the automation can help you to achieve that. That's very difficult to do on a manual basis, and very difficult to do if you're only testing on an annual basis like many companies are. So the third best practice is they're testing their plans much more frequently. They're doing comprehensive tests, they're testing their plans much more frequently, and they're taking action to be able to fix the items that they see are out of compliance. And finally, they're spending at least 2% of their budget on DR. Now, hopefully, if you take a look at the report that we have available and you're struggling to sort of identify what you could be spending, what you should be spending, and justifying budget, we have a very comprehensive report I'll tell you about in just a moment that might be very useful for you to understand, that spend a budget and help you to use it constructively within your organizations. So these are sort of 4 of the best practices. When organizations were doing these 4, guess what? They got an A or B, right? And so there just aren't enough of them. We hope that that you could be part of that group. And so what can you do right now, right? So I'd like to tell you what you could do right now, should you want to, and then point you to a bunch of free tools that are pretty cool that you can use. So first, what can you do right now? I mean, first of all, don't boil the ocean. Don't try and tackle everything at once. That is a sure way to fail. The first thing you can do is make sure your DR plan at least specifies every critical application, every critical component that you need to recover. Again, pretty basic, but just something that you could easily do. There are consultancies that can help you to do that, as well. Secondly, set SLAs for your critical applications. Set them and measure them, number 3, and test them on at least a quarterly basis so you can validate that you actually could recover within those SLAs. If you do those 3 things walking out of here, you will be well on your way to achieving tremendously better results, scoring an A or B on the disaster recovery benchmark, but most importantly, not experiencing the type of financial losses that a lot of the companies admitted to quite candidly within the context of the DR benchmark test. So finally, I wanted to share with you some cool free tools, and I also want to tell you about one that's not here, because there's one that is super cool that is actually being built, and I wanted to tell you about it so you can check on it. So first of all, you could take the DR benchmark for yourself. Go to www.drbenchmark.org, and you could take the benchmark. It takes about 10 minutes, and like I said, you'll immediately get a grade. You'll see how you're doing. It will tell you for each specific area how your results compare to everybody else. It's blind. No one else can see anybody else's results. But it's pretty cool because you get immediate feedback, which is really what people want. Second free tool is also really cool. It's really for folks who have virtual environments. It's called the RTA calculator. What it does is basically for a given set of virtual machines and the critical applications on them is that you load it up. It takes like a minute or two to load it. You spell out sort of the food order, the orchestration order, and then it will tell you literally in hours and minutes how quickly those particular virtual machines and critical applications on them would recover. Not just a recovery time objective, but RTA, or recovery time actual calculator. Now, most organizations really have no idea how long it would actually take to recover. This free tool will tell you that. The DR Benchmark Preparedness Report, this is just sort of a report. It covers many more results than the ones I just covered with you. It's really cool, and you can go to the DR Benchmark site and download it and give it a read. And all this stuff is free. And I wanted to tell you about one other free tool. I'm going to give everyone here my email. If you wanted to get this access to this other free tool, which will be available in 3 months, send me an email. Let me give you my email first. I'll repeat it again at the end, and I'll tell you this is really cool. So it's Steve, S-T-E-V-E-K, at phdvirtual.com. So Steve K. at phdvirtual.com. This tool is really cool. I'm excited about this one. It's free, by the way. What we did is we contracted with some DR experts, and we built a best practices DR plan. This is not like a 1 or 2 page plan. This is like a 35-page best practices plan. So first of all, if you don't have a great plan, or even if you have a good plan and you want to see what a great plan looks like, this is a great plan. And so, so you could get access to it. Now what's cool is it's going to be housed in the Unitrends cloud. So the plan itself is DR proof, but also if you want to communicate with others, and this goes back to my experience going through the disaster we went through, and communication was tough, is you could literally, from your PDA, communicate out to various other stakeholders, hey, gee, we're having an outage, we're having a disaster, you need to march into action. And remember, here are the things you need to do to help us to orchestrate recovery. So we're calling it BCDR Link, and so it's a best practices disaster recovery plan stored in the cloud, accessible by your PDA that you could communicate out to others. And you could basically modify that plan, and what have you. And so, a bunch of free tools for you. Hopefully, some information that was useful, and not taking the full hour either, so as I don't take up extra valuable time of yours. But hopefully, information you could use and go to work right away and improve DR preparedness within your company. So with that, be happy to answer any questions.
Cool. So there's a couple questions. This is Robert, by the way, for everyone listening. There's a couple questions here on if the handouts are going to be available, as well as if this presentation is being recorded. It is being recorded, and everybody's going to get both those who attended and those who registered but could not attend. Everyone will get an email with a link to view this presentation at a later date. So if you were not able to attend, or if you want to reference it at a later date, you'll be able to do so via email that goes out tomorrow from the DRJ. We have a question here on the makeup of the companies that participated in the survey. So, I mean, what was the average size of company that was involved with the survey?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we have that in the report itself, but I guess the best way to answer that is there was companies from small to medium to, you know, some of the biggest enterprises in the world, and really, interestingly, spread across all industries. And by the way, it was global. So this was not respondents just, for example, in the U.S. There were respondents from all over the world. And so what we saw was a big mix. And, you know, one thing I'd ask you is, you know, to the extent that you could spread the word on the drbenchmark.org, the more people that take it, you know, the better the results. So, you know, if those of you are, you know, have, you know, peers or other folks who you think could benefit from it, you know, please spread the word. But, you know, again, over 2,000 now, virtually every industry slanted towards more of the highly regulated industries like financial services, healthcare, government, etc. But companies really of all sizes. And the size-wise, just so everyone knows, sort of almost mirrors if you were, you know, thinking about, like, there's tons of small businesses, less medium-sized, you know, fewer, you know, enterprise-type companies. So the distribution breakdown was pretty much as fell in line with sort of just the sheer distribution of companies that you would see reading, for example, a Dun & Bradstreet report.
Well, and a slight follow-up to that, I would assume, but were there some cloud companies involved in this?
Yeah, absolutely. And so there were cloud companies involved in that, and of course the story that I personally went through was from a cloud company. And so yes, there were.
Great. Yeah, even one more about the makeup of the companies that participated regarding Fortune 500 or 100. We have all that data contained in the report, you know, as much as we can show, you know, maintaining anonymous credentials. So I would encourage everyone to download the report to check out the makeup of the companies that participated. We have a question here about how often you really should be testing your DR plan.
Well, first of all, let me say what you shouldn't do. You shouldn't be testing it never. You shouldn't be testing it annually, and you probably shouldn't be testing semi-annually, because that's what a lot of the companies that are struggling doing. We recommend at least quarterly. Now, the more sophisticated companies get far more sophisticated than that, and by that I mean they will test critical applications or business services even more frequently than that. And so, you know, it's really not a one-size-fits-all, but honestly, that's where the automation comes in, right? Doing all that, and, you know, I've heard stories talking to folks that have taken the benchmark where they have to get a team of people to work weekends to go through the manual testing process that is expensive and a nightmare. And so this is where the automation comes in that I highly encourage companies to take advantage of, such that you could start testing critical applications even more frequently than quarterly, and to make sure that you can recover within SLAs. Again, two tools to help you to do that: VMware SRM and PhD Virtual Reliable DR will help you to do that. Both tools are great. You know, encourage you to make the best decision for your business.
Yeah, and I think you kind of just started to get into it with when you mentioned application and business services. But what types of things should people test for in these DR exercises?
Well, I mean, you know, first of all, what they need to be testing for is testing against recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives. And, you know, really, again, those come back to, you know, the achievement of SLAs. And so at the end of the day, that's really what you're testing for. And you know, the tools that automate this process really allow you to define those objectives and see how you're doing versus what you would actually achieve. And, you know, the real sophisticated tools, what they'll do, they're cool. what they do, so, Reliable DR does this from PhD, for example, is that if you get out of compliance in terms of testing a critical application, let's say it's your e-commerce application, and for whatever reason it identifies that you will be missing your SLA, that green light will turn to red. You'll immediately be notified, and you could take action and fix it, right? And so that's the value of the automation. You could do it manually, but there's lots of things from an IT perspective we used to do manually that we automated. This is sort of the next frontier.
Sometimes it can be tough, justifying the expense of DR planning to upper management, especially in the small and mid-sized business segment, because if it hasn't happened, then there's really it can be tough when there's things happening right now that need money allocated to it versus things that just could happen. Do you have any tips on justifying the costs that are going to be associated with this type of planning to upper management?
Well, I think that clearly when something bad happens, that's unfortunately when money sometimes tends to loosen up, as you rightly mentioned. I think the real thing here is sort of utilizing the report, and in there you sort of see how organizations are allocating expense in terms of their total IT budget, and so to DR-related items, and that very, very much might be helpful. I think secondly is that I think the term disaster recovery has almost done a disservice to what this is all about, and the reason for that is it's like people go, yeah, but if it's a disaster, and disasters, they so infrequently happen, right? And so, I kind of like using the term, business continuity or extended outage, which you'll notice that I used quite a bit, because extended outage, and when you look at the report, really occurring as a result of commonplace things like software failures, network failures, hardware failures, cause it, or just someone making an honest error. These are things that happen all the time. And so I think it's sort of using the report, showing what companies are spending, showing also what actually causes these problems, not talking about it in terms of disaster recovery like it's a once-in-a-lifetime event, but actually that extended outages occur and they have consequences. You're trying to protect that from happening, and then using sort of like how much you should be spending, which is indicated in the report. I think that those are ways to become a little bit more effective rather than waiting for the next bad thing to occur.
Great. And just one last question, just to clarify your email address again.
Sure. So it's Steve, S-T-E-V-E-K, at phdvirtual.com. And, as we come out with this free tool, I'm really excited about it. I'll just collect the emails and I'll send you links to it. And I'd be happy to send you links to, other free tools that we come out, or even if you have a personal question that you want to ask as it relates to, advice as it relates to DR, I'd be very happy to respond to you to the best of my ability as well.
Great. So that's going to conclude the Q&A portion, and I'll just turn it over to Steve and Bob for any closing thoughts.
Perfect. Thanks again, Steve and Robert. Any parting words here today, Steve?
I just hope everyone has a great day.
All right. Well, that was simple enough. Thanks again, everyone, for their attendance here today. We again hope you found some great information from today's webinar. DRJ would also like to thank Steve for his time here today, as well as PhD Virtual for sponsoring today's webinar. As Robert mentioned earlier, we will be emailing everyone a link to the recording of this webinar. You may view this webinar as frequently as you wish or share it with your peers. If you do have any additional questions, please contact Disaster Recovery Journal. Thank you again, and this now ends today's webinar.